In my previous video, titled Bernie's Plan to Seize the Means of Production, where I discussed Sanders' plan to establish a measure of worker ownership over American corporations, I mentioned that as innovative as the proposal was, it was by no means a concept without precedent. I mentioned and briefly described the proposal made in 1970 Sweden, known as the Meidner Plan, that was developed to gradually establish social ownership of Swedish industry. I also mentioned that I intended to eventually do a video on it in order to talk about the proposal, such as the situation it was developed in, why it was designed as it was, and what followed from it. Now is the time for that video. In fact, this will be the first in a series of at least 3 videos on the Meidner Plan. I am currently aiming to have these videos released one after another, but if there are video-worthy topics I find in the meanwhile, this might change. This video will be talking about the context in which the Meidner Plan was developed. Why the life of its core designer, Rudolf Meidner, a Swedish economist, extremely important not only to the plan with his namesake, but the whole Swedish economic order that it would have been applied within, is interesting enough to be a topic of at least a video. For the sake of focus, I will be glossing over that in favor of painting a bigger historical picture. Through this series, one of the main sources I'll be drawing from is the paper Socializing Capital, Looking Back at the Meidner Plan by Joe Guinan, which I will link in the description and is well worth a read on its own. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Sweden, like most wartime economies, had recently exited a period of immense levels of state planning. They had ample experience with the fact that it was, in fact, possible and even effective to operate an economy with a large degree of central planning of goods and services, with goods being rationed and directed for the goals of the state, without the dependence of an economy dominated by privately owned firms operating in a free market. So, like in other countries, towards the end of the war, the Swedish left wing started developing plans for a peacetime planned economy. While this was never implemented, it does emphasize the fact that policymakers were convinced of the ability of the state to play a large, effective role in the economy. In the post-war era, Sweden had a booming economy, its neutrality during the war giving it an advantage similar to what the United States' distance from the conflict helped convey it into the post-war era. Namely, as they were not the target of bombing campaigns and ground warfare, their industry was intact to sell to those who had been. This had the consequence of limiting and to a degree extinguishing the urgency for the state to intervene in the planning side of the economy. In this boom environment, private capital was more than capable of creating the production and capital investment necessary not only for a growing economy, but an economy with low unemployment. However, in keeping with the trend around the Western world at the time, there was still an appetite for the creation of a welfare state, and in this case, particularly one tied to union activity. This led eventually to a strategy formalized by what is known as the Meidner model. This model was developed by Rudolf Meidner alongside Swedish economist Gösta Rehn of the Swedish Trade Union Confederation. This model had 4 overarching policy goals. Low inflation, keep prices stable to create a consistent economic environment. Full employment, encourage hiring and entrance into workplaces across sectors of the economy. High growth, being able to afford increasing standards of living and having an economy consistently worth investing in. Income equality, have an economy that maximizes fairness between sectors. In order to achieve these aims, Sweden built an expansive welfare state and a public sector capable of counteracting economic downturns by maintaining strong state spending. This also came with progressive taxation, having higher taxes for those with higher incomes and lower taxes for those with lower incomes. However, there is something critical to the implementation of the Meidner model that made it different from other welfare state systems. Swedish unions played a critical role in the economy, but it wasn't simply one of conflict. In 1938, Swedish labor unions, through its national organization, the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, came to an agreement with the Swedish Employers Association, the National Organization for Businesses, in which they agreed to negotiate in a manner that benefited both sides while minimizing social conflict. This meant unions strong enough to negotiate a position of increasing wages alongside economic growth and full employment. However, the consequence of this was price instability, inflation. Unions rationally pushed for higher wages, and businesses rationally raised prices to increase profits. This created a contradiction. The goals of the Meidner model included low inflation, and the traditional way to decrease inflation in this context would be to allow an increase in unemployment. Yet the Meidner model also aimed to ensure full employment. In order to achieve the aims of the model, two measures had to be taken to address inflation while still maintaining full employment, and simultaneously pursuing income equality and high growth. Unions accepted policies and changes in conditions that meant encouraging unprofitable firms to shut down or increase their productivity, decreasing inflation by increasing the amount of goods that money was chasing after. Also, unions had to organize and develop wage solidarity policies that ensured that low-wage workers would receive the bulk of the increase in wages, with high-wage workers receiving a cut-down in wage increases, therefore cutting down on inflation. While these changes seem as if they work well enough to achieve the goals of the Meidner model, income inequality did in fact decrease between low and high-wage workers, a new problem presented itself. Measures to increase productivity of unprofitable sectors and measures to decrease the wage increases of those who worked in high-income sectors ultimately served to ensure that those who owned businesses were the primary beneficiaries of the increases in economic growth. This had consequences beyond simply increasing the incomes of those who owned capital. It ensured that the group of people who owned capital were a smaller and smaller portion of the population, a vast concentration of wealth. This threatened to undermine the welfare state model, as that concentrated wealth, as we're all familiar with, was economic power that could easily be converted into political power that could be used to perpetuate wealth, and therefore economic power, and therefore political power, and so on. It's important to emphasize that the wealth that threatened to undermine the social democracy was created by the social democracy itself. In fact, Swedish social democracy was unique in its ability to create this immense wealth concentration. IKEA's growth in the 1950s and 60s was boosted by being a primary provider of furnishing for homes as part of a state procurement program for social housing, a dynamic that might be familiar to those who are aware of how the military-industrial complex operates in the United States. Sweden had, relative to the size of its economy, twice as many Fortune 500 companies as the UK, and 4 times as many as Germany. This measures more than simply the amount of wealth being generated, but the fact that it was concentrated enough to allow multiple companies to slip into the upper tier of global company valuations from a country with a relatively small population. Even beyond the basic reality that wealth could easily be transformed into political power, there was a direct power emanating from shareholder control that could be exercised to directly control the direction of companies. Such a concentration meant that worker representation could not properly exploit the differing interests of shareholders in order to shape businesses towards the benefit of labor. So, now with these problems explained, one can understand the environment in which the Meidner Plan was conceived. In the next video, I'll be covering the Meidner Plan itself. Consider liking and sharing this video. Also, subscribe and click the notification button in order to be alerted when my next video comes out. Thank you.